I'd like to call to order the special formal meeting of the Iowa City City Council for April 17th, 2018. Roll call, please.
Botchway?
Yes, here.
Pickens? I'm sorry, I don't have my list.
Not here.
Not here. Cole?
Here.
Mims? Here. Taylor? Here. Thomas?
Here.
Sully? Yeah. Throgmorton?
Here. Item 2, appeal of Historic Preservation Commission decision. Deciding the appeal to the City Council of the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission denying a certificate of appropriateness to apply aluminum siding at 318 North Gilbert Street in the North Side Historic District. We have to follow specific procedures in this, which Eleanor has laid out for us, which is part of the formal meeting agenda packet. We'll do our best to follow those procedures, and Eleanor, if we slide off course in terms of following those procedures, please alert us. Thank you. So I want to make a suggestion to the council to see if you agree. The suggestion is that we allocate not more than 30 minutes per party to present their material, whatever it is they want to tell us, and then allocate ourselves another 30 minutes to discuss what we think we need to do. Is that agreeable with the parties? And is it agreeable with the council? Yeah, okay, so could somebody help time this?
We should just reflect that the parties indicated agreement with that.
Right, thank you. So can somebody help me keep track of this? All right, good deal, thank you. So I think we should begin with Jenny Swaim, right, with the Historic Preservation Commission. Hi, Jenny.
Hello, everyone. Hope you got outside today. It's actually nice and sunny. I'm Jenny Swaim, the chair of the Historic Preservation Commission. Thank you all for taking this time to listen to this appeal. And I actually am going to defer for the first part to Jessica Bristow, who is the Historic Preservation Planner for the city. She's going to walk you through what has happened from the initial contact with her, and then I will pick up when it came to the full Historic Preservation Commission. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, I'm Jessica Bristow, Historic Preservation Planner and staff member for the Commission. This project first came to staff, myself.
Pardon me, Jessica, did I formally open the public hearing?
I don't think you did.
Yeah, so I'm going to open the public hearing and acknowledge that Jenny Swaim spoke briefly right prior to this, but it should be accounted as part of the public hearing. Thank you.
Okay. So as I began, the project first came to staff when a rental inspector told staff that they would be receiving a call about 318 North Gilbert because it needed painting, and this was about mid-September in 2017. Later, staff found out that it had been cited for needing painting back in November of 2016. The deadline for the work had passed when the rental inspector told us about it. On September 26th, staff had voicemails from both the owner and a siding salesperson, and staff called the owner discussing the process for review, including visiting the property and putting in an application for historic review. The owner had mentioned vinyl replacement siding and also the fact that there was a siding salesperson. I talked to them about the fact that because it's in a historic district, painting any existing, potentially original siding would be the preferred thing. And the owner did discuss the difficulty in finding a painter who would be able to work with the paint on the house because it was potentially had lead in it. And staff, myself, followed up with an email that included both the application for historic review and a list of at least 10 paint contractors who can and will work with lead paint. On September 27th, the next day, I talked to the siding salesperson. I reiterated the process that we need to review the property on site and look at what the condition of the siding is, that application for review needed to be put in, basically talking to them about the fact that we needed to do a formal review and that all of our approvals are written approvals. I was given the impression that the existing siding may be masonite, which is a replacement siding that's used fairly frequently and deteriorates rather quickly when compared to something like cedar or redwood, typical lap siding. Because of the fact that that could be the case, we did discuss what appropriate replacement materials could be possible. Again, reiterating the fact that we needed to review the siding before approval could be given. At that time, when we discussed any appropriate materials, we talked about the fact that it would be a smooth siding that would be approvable, not something with fake wood grain that vinyl typically has. So we discussed the idea of aluminum siding. Again, no formal approval was given. No application for review had been submitted at this time. We did discuss this as what would be appropriate if replacement was warranted. Because it was listed as non-historic, a smooth aluminum siding could be considered. And I also told them that I would visit that day. This is 318 Gilbert Street on September 27th. Can you maybe dim the lights? And this is what we saw. There was quite a bit of brush along the alley. There's an alley on the right side of the property there. As you can see, this is the south side of the house, also facing the alley. And in that bump out part with the gable, there's peeling paint. When I look at this on site, I see peeling paint. I see some of the wood showing. It was very evident that there was wood grain, which means it's not masonite. It was then either cedar or redwood. And because the wood grain is kind of gray, it was obvious that it needed to be prepped properly before painting. All of the paint would need to be stripped off. The grayness needed to be sanded off. The correct moisture content needed to be checked. It needed to be primed with an oil-based primer and then painted. And after I visited the house on September 27th, this is just a back view of the house at that time so that you can see it, I then turned around and immediately emailed the owner, since they were the responsible party, and told them that the siding was in good condition and should be painted. Confirmed that the painters on the list would be able to deal with the lead paint, and also talked to them about the appropriate preparation and techniques for painting so that when they talked to painting contractors, they could be informed about the process. I also talked to them about the fact that the stone in the front entry should not be painted over. It would need to be remain uncovered. And let's see. Oh, and then I said that siding replacement was not warranted because of the relatively good condition of the siding. The only place where I really found any rot or anything was, well, I don't know if this mouse works. Oops. Up near the gutter on that, you can see just a little bit of deterioration, and that was about all I saw for deterioration on this house, and that would be very typical, and that's a small piece of wood that could be replaced. On September 28th, then, I also talked to the siding salesperson and told them the same thing that I told the owner, and the salesperson told me that the siding had been ordered. I told them that no approval had been given for the project, and in fact, no application had been submitted seeking approval, and I told them that the siding was in good condition, so it should just be painted. I received several phone calls, including a phone call on October 3rd, again with the siding salesperson that was much like before, again telling them that the siding was in good condition, it needed to be painted, and replacement was not warranted. On October 12th, there was an email from the siding salesperson to her supervisors copying myself and Bob Miklo, who she had also talked to in the interim. And basically it was explaining why she had lost a siding sale. And it also explained that the owner had originally contracted for vinyl siding back on September 1st, long before they had ever talked to any of us. I responded basically just to clarify a few points in the email that I thought were incorrect. On October 20th, finally, an application for siding replacement was submitted. I replied to them that since I could not recommend replacement because the siding was in good condition, that we would then put this before the commission for review. Basically, all properties in a historic district need to be reviewed when it comes down to siding. With this property, here's a few more photos. Right before the meeting, I went back, and on November 2nd, I took another photo, and it showed that somebody had tried to go over the peeling paint area on that bump out and put basically a thin coat. It was probably either a primer or a paint coat over it so that at least the peeling paint didn't show. That was not the proper technique, so that would not last. But there was an attempt to remediate the problem a little bit. This property, as you can see from the star, is in the very bottom part of the Northside Historic District. At the time that the district was created and that this property was surveyed, it was considered non-historic. For historic preservation, historic is at least 50 years old. Once a property reaches that 50-year threshold, it can be considered historic. For this district, we have a group of houses that are basically date from about 1860 to the 1930s as far as the properties that contribute to the district, that all go towards making the district what it is. When we look at whether a property is historic or not, once it's 50 years old, then we also determine, is it contributing to the district or is it not contributing to the district? If it was built outside of this regular period of design, it would be considered non-contributing. When I wrote the staff report to the commission about this property, I also discussed that because this property, while it was non-historic in the district, could be considered historic now. We don't know if it would be considered contributing or non-contributing. That's something that would need to happen when the whole district was evaluated. It is historic. That is kind of the point. But when we presented it to the commission, we presented it as it was non-historic. A non-historic property in a historic district can have a specific exception granted towards it. What happens in that case is the commission reviews it to see if it has any historic character that could be considered worthy of preservation. While I was looking at this property, I see a house that hits all, this is taken just the other day, so all of the brush has been removed, all the paint has been touched up. It's still not a good finish paint job with proper prepping, but it looks all white and cleaned up right now. This house meets all of the key characteristics that would show it to us as a mid-century modern ranch house. It has a broad, low, one-story shape. It has a low-pitch roof without any dormers. It has the the large picture window in the stone area. It's asymmetrical. meaning it's not balanced and equal on both sides. It's built low to the ground. The front entry is off-centered and sheltered under that main roof and recessed into the L. That's one of the specific ranch types. And the windows, you can't really see them in this picture, but it has a top and bottom sash, and they're divided horizontally just once in each sash. And that's also very typical of a ranch house. And it also has shutters only on the front. When I look at this house, it has all of its original storm windows, siding. Nothing seems to have been changed on this house. So it had all of the historic characteristics of a ranch house. That is what the commission then was charged with reviewing. Does it have any of these characteristics that make it worthy of preservation? And at that point, they had determined that it did, and that's where Gina Lee comes in.
Thank you. So the Commission reviewed this application November 9th at its regular monthly meeting. The staff presented the report and showed exterior photos of the property, and all this is in your packet. The staff report addressed 5 pertinent issues: the age and architectural style of the house. Every report always begins with that. Its historic or non-historic status in the district, likewise its contributing or non-contributing status, when exceptions to guidelines are allowed or disallowed, and the condition of the existing siding. Note, siding here means the cladding of the house. It's not a word we often think of in earlier houses, but in this case, the siding is probably redwood or cedar, what many of our older houses are, of course. And siding is one of the defining characteristics of a historic district and therefore protected by the guidelines. So in brief, the staff's detailed descriptions and photos from the site visit show this 1958 house to be an intact representation of a typical mid-century modern ranch style. Though the house is modest, it retains its original form, details, and materials. When the neighborhood survey was completed in 1998, this 1958 house was classified as non-historic because it was not yet 50 years old, the threshold. Note, as Jessica said, the house has since passed that threshold and can now be considered historic. I should also note there's growing interest in mid-century modern ranch-style houses, especially among the youngest population of home seekers. In fact, last year, the Parade of Homes by Friends of Historic Preservation featured mid-century homes. In other words, what was not yet thought of as significant in 1998 is now drawing great interest and protection. The house, furthermore, is considered non-contributing because the year it was built, 1958, lies outside the period of significance for the district. It's from a different era. Nevertheless, non-contributing and non-historic properties are not exempt from preservation guidelines. Applications for siding replacement in a historic district require a permit and review. Exceptions can exist for non-historic houses. Applications for exceptions are reviewed on a case-by-case basis. The staff report and photos show that the original cedar or redwood lap siding was in good condition, except some minimal deterioration around the gutters where rot is often expected. It showed that the wood siding only needed proper preparation and a new paint job. The commission carefully analyzed the staff's findings, including the photographic evidence, asked questions of the applicant and staff, and then adhered to the guidelines. A, the siding is not deteriorated beyond repair. Therefore, by the guidelines, there are no grounds for replacing it. B, the house is worthy of preservation as a good example of mid-century modern ranch and is considered historic. It is over 50 years. Therefore, no exception should be allowed. The commission voted unanimously to deny the application. I believe the record shows that the commission followed the guidelines and did not act in an arbitrary or capricious manner. Thank you.
You all finished right now, right? Okay. It would be appropriate for us to ask questions, I believe, of the presenters, Jenna Lee and Jessica. You're supposed to follow certain guidelines. I heard Jenna Lee say right there at the end that you did follow the guidelines published in the Iowa City Historic Preservation Handbook, which are based on the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehabilitation
Yes.
and other things, right? Okay, and yeah, all right. So would anybody on the our council like to ask Jessica or Jenna Lee any questions?
There were both of you said that the structure can be considered historic. Does that mean that it has historic status? Is that
There's been no official review of this district to determine if all of the non-historic properties in the district are now historic. When we look at it individually, we would consider that, yes, it's historic because it is 50 years old. Technically, we would also look at the fact that it actually represents a known architectural style in that as well. It is assumed that at some point when the commission is not obligated with other concerns, that they will actually go through each of the districts and look at the non-contributing and non-historic properties and review them to see if they still are non-historic or non-contributing. And at that point, this house would definitely become historic, and then it would be reviewed whether or not it would be contributing or non-contributing. And that would depend on whether or not the post-war infill was considered a contributing part of the district, which in this instance, it probably could be. It is something that was talked about in the original review of the district, that there was this kind of infill that was happening. So it could become contributing even to the district. But currently, we would look at this house individually as historic.
Just to pin down a couple facts to get them on the record. Do I understand correctly? Huh?
Just rose up.
I just pushed a button here and it rose a little bit. I didn't know it did
there's
that.
another button you can rise up too. Do I understand correctly that the Department of Interior's guidelines and the city's historic preservation manual basically reject covering original siding with, quote, synthetic siding, and that the manual and the guidelines define aluminum as synthetic?
Yeah, it was something that came up in our commission meeting, that aluminum is on the periodic table, so how could it be synthetic? But both the Secretary of the Interior and our guidelines consider asbestos, aluminum, vinyl, or asphalt fake brick-looking siding as synthetic siding, and it is recommended in our guidelines to actually remove that type of siding to any historic property and not apply it, because while it may last longer than a wood siding, it will deteriorate, it may need replacing, and it also tends to trap moisture, and it can lead to the deterioration of any historic siding that's underneath. Also, applying it can mean that you need to cut back trim and other things so that the historic material can be damaged as well when it's applied.
And again, these guidelines apply whether it's contributing or non-contributing? Is that true?
Correct. The guidelines apply to every property in a district or a local landmark. It's just that there are some exceptions that are available for properties that are non-contributing or non-historic. And that's why we talked about the idea of the possibility of putting some aluminum siding on this house, because there is an exception for non-historic properties in a historic district. There is not an exception for that for non-contributing properties in a historic district. So if this property had been reviewed and determined just to be non-contributing, that exception wouldn't apply at all either.
I, for one, will admit that I got confused in reading the written material about whether the structure is historic or non-historic, and does the distinction make a difference. And I couldn't fully track the written text in the denial of the application, the Commission's formal denial of the application, relative to the statement that generally provided us in writing, and the minutes of the Commission's meeting. I'll put that weight on myself largely, but I will admit that I've had trouble tracking the distinction and whether the distinction makes a difference. So can you please restate as clearly and slowly as you can precisely what, how the Commission defined this house and how that definition played into the decision the Commission finally made?
I admit that the guidelines sometimes are confusing because they involve legal language, and that's why I'm here to help people wade through what they mean. When the Commission was determining whether or not to approve the citing, they talked about the house and whether or not it had any redeeming historical character that was worthy of preservation. Whether or not the house is historic, it is whether or not it has some characteristic to be preserved that was determined by the Commission. When it is found that while it might be modest, it is very characteristic of a mid-century ranch house, they determined that that meant that it then was worthy of preservation and denied the application of citing. The question of whether or not it is historic or non-historic is only about whether or not they can apply the exception at all. Since we discussed the exception, and the exception is only for non-historic properties, we went with the fact that on the map and in the guidelines, it is listed as non-historic. So we applied the exception. We didn't go through the formal process of deciding that it is historic, because then the exception wouldn't have been allowed at all.
Right. That was my concern and question, was it, before I'd read the minutes of the meetings, that it seemed straight away there was a trigger here in that it had passed the 50-year threshold and therefore was historic, as I understood it. And historic structures in an historic district do not qualify for an exception.
I think that there would have been a greater concern with this process if we had just decided, oh, it's historic, so we can't do the exception at all, and just discounted that without any formal review of its historic quality at all. Since we did not do that, and we went ahead and allowed the exception to be discussed and reviewed by the Commission, I think that shows that we followed the guidelines even more closely than we would if we just looked at the house.
So in the 50s, vinyl siding was not used at all. That never can be considered historic or appropriate. I think, is that a new phenomenon? And the same thing would be with aluminum as well?
I'm personally not really up on when vinyl siding started. I think it's more that we look at this house and it's pretty apparent that it has its original siding. And so with that in mind, we want to keep that original siding. Now, if it was deteriorated so that it could be covered or replaced, then that's when we would have looked at some kind of an aluminum siding or something that might have been appropriate at the time of the construction of the house, but it's because the fact that the siding itself wasn't deteriorated, we didn't want to hurt it further by covering it with something that would deteriorate that historic siding.
So if it had been at a greater state of deterioration, you could have foreseen a circumstances where vinyl could have been used. Am I understanding that correctly?
I can see a circumstance where a replacement siding could have been used. Whether or not it's vinyl or aluminum, I would think it would still tend more towards aluminum than vinyl. Because I think, with the limited knowledge I have on vinyl and aluminum siding, I think that aluminum was potentially more appropriate during the 50s than vinyl. And we also would tend to not approve the fake wood grain texture, and most vinyl siding tends to be that. I know that it's possible to get vinyl siding that's smooth, but it's much more expensive and much more difficult to get it. So in this case, I think that it would have been an aluminum siding that would have been approved over vinyl, but I didn't review that because of the fact that it wasn't deteriorated. It was something that we discussed in the phone conversations with both the owner and the siding salesperson as possibilities, but no approval was given and never is given over the phone.
And in deciding whether something is appropriate or not, are you solely limited by what the Department of Interior guidelines are, or how much discretion do you have? You talked about the case-by-case standard. Is that the sole definition in terms of the Department of the Interior guidelines in terms of what's appropriate and what's not?
We definitely look at them, and it's when they are not clear on something where we do further research. Because of the fact that mid-century modern is something that's just starting to become National Register listing eligible and really considered historic, it's something that we would do research on. And we do a lot of research on every property, even when the guidelines and the Secretary of the Interiors are clear on things. We do research just to make sure that we get things right, because when we're talking about built structures that could last for hundreds of years, we don't want to make mistakes. So we would do research for that.
I'd like to just add one point. One of the major tenets of preservation is that one repairs rather than replaces. So repair of original materials is always the preferred method, and you'll see that in the guidelines, the Secretary of Interior's as well as our own. Something has to be very, very deteriorated, in some cases irreparable, before we would allow some kind of replacement.
I have a feeling we're pretty much at the 30-minute mark, but I'd like to ask one more question, please, which this is going to go over territory already trod, but I'm reading the text of the denial of a certificate of appropriateness. The part that begins, the exception exists for non-historic properties in historic districts, where the structure may be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Do you see where I am in the text? Mm-hmm. Okay, and then I'm going to skip the next few lines, but and then it says, as you've noted, at the time of the original survey, the property was classified as non-historic because it wasn't 50 years old and so on. But then the text says, now the house would be considered non-contributing to the district, but would be considered historic. Mm-hmm. Because it's more than 50 years old. And this is all part of this is part of the rationale for denying the exception, right? So now the house would be considered non-contributing to the district, but would be considered historic because it's more than 50 years old. And then as a representative of mid-century modern homes, the property is intact and worthy of preservation. The existing material should be maintained. So I'm having trouble following that rationale. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the rest of you are, and we need to hear from the other folks before we
sure.
Say anything explicit about this, but I'm not sure how we get from the exception exists for non-historic properties, and then we get to now the house would be considered non-contributing, but would be considered historic. So
sure.
Just kind of leave it there. Yeah.
Well, and I'd like to point out that the actual reason for the We discussed the historic and non-historic in the denial because it exists as a fact and something that we discussed for the property. But the actual reason for the denial is the line that follows that says, as a representative of mid-century modern homes, the property is intact and worthy of preservation. That is the key line that's really the reason why the exception was denied. It is showing that whether it's historic or not, we use the non-historic exception, and it was found that as a representative of mid-century modern homes, it fits the definition and all the characteristics of a ranch home. And because it is intact, it's worthy of preservation, and therefore the application is denied. So it's really actually that key line after that is the real crux of the reason why the application is denied and what fits the exception. The rest is included because it was discussed so much at length during the review and here and everywhere else. But whether or not it's historic, it's this fact that is the reason for the denial.
Okay, thank you.
Question about preservation.
Sorry?
Can I ask her a quick question about preservation?
Yeah.
So when you say intact and worthy of preservation, you're referring, as you mentioned earlier, to the materials, not necessarily the building itself and staying on that lot, but preserving the materials, the original materials, as you've said, seem to be in good conditions. That's what you're referring to when you say preservation?
Yeah, I would think actually both. I mean, we wouldn't want to take it down and remove it either, but yeah, preserving the materials, therefore not covering it with siding that could lead to rot and the destruction of the historic materials.
Thank you.
Or original materials, if you'd rather.
Okay, thank you. I think we should probably shift to the applicant for an exception, the owner of the property. Yeah. Hi, good evening.
Well, good evening.
Please state your name and we'll go from there.
Happily. I'm Bill Leopold from 13515 253rd Avenue, Spirit Lake, Iowa. I bring you greetings from the land of ice and snow. 12 inches Saturday, and we have another 6 or 7 coming today and tomorrow.
Agony.
I heard a lot of could, may, it might rot. We'd like to keep it original. I was happy to hear at this hearing that aluminum is considered an appropriate covering. Aluminum siding was invented or used since 1948, so it would be quite appropriate to put on this building. Now, Jessica's narrative was very good, but she did miss one step, and I'll let my son explain that. You also heard that this house may contain lead paint. Now, in thinking of covering this with aluminum, that paint would be contained. It would be better for the environment. It would keep the house looking historically correct. Plus, it would limit the amount of upkeep that the house would need. I'll admit that's part of my idea for doing this. We were fully going to have it painted by painters. My son will explain that. We have checked into getting someone who might scrape the paint legally, but we still feel that the aluminum siding would keep this in its historic context. Now, at the hearing, the only thing that was said about the aluminum siding was, A, it would still need upkeep, and B, it might get wasps behind it. I didn't quite feel that the board really considered that. And earlier, when we called, we talked to Mr. Nicklay, is that the name? Nicklay? About coming before the board, and we were told, well, that probably wouldn't do any good. So it was almost like there was a prior day on this, that the decision was already made. Questions were not fully asked or explanations asked for. I still think aluminum siding would be good for this. It would keep it in its historic context. Jared?
Hello.
Good evening, Jared. Would you please state your name, please?
Absolutely. My name's Jared Leopold. I'm the current resident at 318 North Gilbert Street. So I want to go back to how this whole process started, and actually why we're even here, probably. So going, well, maybe even further back. So we looked at getting the house painted, contacted 2 or 3 painters to ask them, hey, what can we do, what are we looking at? Like, well, we're not going to really touch it because it's got lead paint in it. So you need to contact this person. Even folks that normally do lead paint, they didn't want to touch it. Not quite sure why. I don't know if it was a money thing or the project was too small. We've, in fact, since contacted someone that could do it for the lead, and they actually recommended not to do it. But that's neither here nor there. So then the next part, talked to my folks, like, well, let's take a look at maybe siding on it then instead. Met with a salesperson from Acre, and we just talked about 2 different things. We're looking at mason and also possibly vinyl on there. Leave the brick exposed, and actually the shutter windows would stay the same. They just do a build out on it. So how we got here in the first place is that I played phone tag with Jessica back and forth. And then finally she left a message one day stating that the home would be okay to have siding on it, and I didn't need to worry about anything. So that's the message I got. Felt my due diligence was already done, got the approval by phone, and so I went ahead and spoke to the sales agent and got the siding set up to get done. And then, all right, I've got, after that was my part into it, and then the rest of it was taken up by here.
Okay. All right, I'm up.
Could you state your name, please?
I'm Julia Leopold, also of Spirit Lake. And thank you so much for allowing us to come today. I know you all have busy schedules, and we appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. And first thing I'd like to do, I think, is to ask, how many of you did you read the minutes from the November 9th meeting?
I did. It was in the packet.
Okay. Well, I appreciate they were long and arduous as much as the speeches that have been done today. But this is what I have to say, I guess. As you heard Jared say, he contacted different painters to paint the house with no success. Jessica sent me a list of painters, that's true, but I got a little discouraged. One address was where a felony arrest had taken place, so I was really a little reluctant to engage that person. Another company is retired and I think no longer painting. One was from Anamosa, one was from Tipton. Another one, I was reading their website and they sounded really good. They said, oh, the first thing we do is power wash that house. Oh, the handbook says you cannot do that. So I tried to pursue quite a few of those names that she gave me, but it didn't seem like the thing to do. And at that point I said, well, let's put siding on this house. Again, trying to relieve the painting issue for a long-term solution. Now, it's been my assumption that as an employee of City Hall and city government, Jessica Bristow you have hired as your preservation planner, your expert. She has several degrees in art and architecture and so forth. And, you know, it would seem obvious. I took her at her word. You know, Jared took her at her word when he was told, go ahead, you can do anything. And he proceeded to order siding. You know, she represents you as a historical commission. And my goodness, have all of you read the 107-plus page handbook? You know, it is pretty confusing. It's contradictory. You can go to one page, it says one thing, and on the next one it says something else. It truly does. It's very confusing. But the historical district that our home is in, as Jessica said, covers 1850 to 1930. And so those guidelines that are set out for that say paint. Well, of course it says paint. Paint was the only option for many, many years. But as my husband pointed out, aluminum siding was in use by that time. And we are certainly not changing the structure. I love that it's a mid-50s modern house that Jessica described. It's wonderful. And trust me, it's wonderful inside, too. But the commission only deals with the exterior, the outside. So in 3.2 of the handbook, it specifically states that new technology, materials, and practices which contribute to the preservation of a building, in this case, this home, would be appropriate. Now, you've heard what we've said and kind of getting down to the crux of it. In the affidavit from the city attorney, it says that the only means that we have is to prove that Jessica's actions were arbitrary and capricious. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe they were. Capricious also says in our handout given, I can find it, that protocol will be done for you lawyers that are here. It says in judges of the world, if they didn't follow correct procedure, they can be charged with arbitrary and capricious. And that's what Jessica did. She told Jared he could put on siding. Then she told myself and our siding representative, sure, you can put aluminum siding on if it meets these guidelines. If it fits the same profile of wood that is on there, if it has no wood grain, I find that kind of ironic. Wood is original, but we mustn't let it look like wood. Don't cover up the stonework. I wouldn't dream of covering up that stonework. It's wonderful. And so, our Acre Company representative hunted around and they found an aluminum siding that would be appropriate and in keeping with 1950s style aluminum siding. So my point is Jessica did not do research. It took her till September 26th or 7th that she told you. Finally then, after she had already told Jared, do anything, after the 1st of September, she told myself and my representative, this aluminum is fine if it meets criteria. It was only after that that she actually went the less than 4 blocks north of here to physically look at that house. And she stated the same in her testimony, September 26th and 27th. Now, I think that's a little bit erratic behavior for someone who is a professional in her field. She is the expert. So I think I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you.
Any questions?
Maybe, is there anybody else in your group that wants to speak?
Nicholas Akery. I'm a U of I grad. I own a few homes here, but I've come out of Illinois. I'd just like to help this board. I come from a town, Rock Island, Illinois. We have a historic district with beautiful homes, the 1800s mansions that were from railroad people or John Deere people that have a lot of historic significance. The time period, I looked through the Iowa City winters. Those homes have a lot of, the winters have a lot of historic significance. This home, I'm pretty sure most of everybody here agrees that nobody's coming off the highway to view this home. This isn't a home that's, Iowa City has some homes, but this isn't one of them. So on the subject of conforming and non-conforming, I talked to my local, as this is kind of a, not a friendly relationship. I talked to just my local person in Rock Island who lives in that district, who's sat on the board for 30 years, and I said, what is the difference between a contributing structure and a non-contributing structure? This home is considered a non-contributing structure. She said, okay, if it's non-contributing, you have a lot more leeway in interpreting the rules. Okay, i.e., if even in her home, which is an immaculate mansion, if she decided to build a garage in the back, that would be a non-contributing structure. She said she would put vinyl siding on that structure. But on her home, from the 1800s, no, absolutely not. So this home, the paint is, unfortunately, they let it go too far. Once wood gets water in it, you're not going to take the boards off, get them back in a kiln and get all that water out. You're going to end up painting it, and it's going to pop. I watched it in Rock Island. I've been in the siding industry for 30 years. Even the beautiful homes that are in that time period have siding on them right now because the Historic Commission said, no, you need to paint them, and people walked away from them, and they sat. They sat in condemned state until they finally decided, you know what, maybe we're causing too much cost for what we're trying to accomplish, and that is we're trying to preserve this neighborhood. And so they started to focus on the details, the big corbels or the architectural window treatments and things like that, and not the siding. And what she said to me, and I sent her this picture of this house, and she said, architecturally speaking, she would like to see the same profile. Even a 7 or an 8-inch, that's an 8-inch, 7 or an 8-inch. She said from the street, you can't tell the difference between aluminum and vinyl. I mean, there is some stigma, i.e., since I've been doing this for 30 years. The vinyl siding 30 years ago, my dad wouldn't even let me put it on, wouldn't let us do it. But today's vinyl siding, you can't, from a street, you can't tell the difference. It doesn't have a high gloss finish. It doesn't have, it looks more like painted wood than anything. The other nice thing about it is because this for sure has lead-based paint on it, and I've taken siding off of houses that we did 30 years ago, you can still literally see the pencil marks where guys wrote down 110 inches. The pencil lead will still be there. So it really does do a great job of encasing this and preserving it without a lot of cost and a lot of danger in lead-based paint remediation, because the Akery Company is a lead-based paint certified contractor, and those costs are fairly significant if you want to try to remove lead-based paint and deal with it, because nobody wants to see that in children's mouths. And it's something that can get caught in the air and blow. And literally looking at this structure, literally the neighbor has vinyl siding on her house. I mean, literally right next door. So to say that this one is somehow historically significant, I would say the things that I would look for is the same things that my acquaintance in Rock Island look for, and say, hey, let's not change it from a wide lap siding to a low lap siding. I could see them requesting that. I could see them requesting, hey, let's not remove the stone. I could see them saying, let's not alter the window size, let's not cut in a giant window or something like that. But nothing that we're trying to accomplish here with putting on a wide board siding is going to change the look of that house from the street. And it's going to be in lead-based safe practices, and it should give these folks a good value moving forward. Do you have any other questions on the difference between conforming and non-conforming now?
And no, thanks. Yeah, I think you meant non-contributing.
Non-contributing, yeah.
Right.
Contributing,
no, thanks.
I'll say one more thing. I ran out of steam. If Jessica's actions were arbitrary and capricious, which is what this whole hearing is about, as I understand it, she made the arbitrary decision that Jerry could do anything he wanted to, and so he ordered siding. Then she told me, and I was happy to oblige the things that she wanted and comply with her wishes, so I'm trying to meet her halfway about the aluminum siding. So that's 2 times she had opinions. And then, much to my shock, when she sent her staff proposal, it said, oh, this is a historical house, it's 50 years old, and will only recommend paint. Well, isn't paint a little arbitrary, too? Like I said, that was all that was available before 1930, 40. That's what they used. But she made 3 different decisions. Now, you are all professionals. Do you get 3 tries to get the answer when you are working with people, clients, patients? Do you get 3 tries? Can you say this and that, and then, oh, by the way, that sounds pretty arbitrary and capricious to me. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask one quick question. Was the house originally built with aluminum siding on it?
No, it was not.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions for the family?
You've owned it for how long? How many years?
20 years.
And you had painted it during that time a few times?
Yes, it's been painted.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think, though I did not say this at the outset, it seems to me it would be fair to offer each side, like, 3 minutes rebuttal. Is that a reasonable thing to do? And before it generally speaks, I'd just like to note that we're not assessing whether a staff member acted arbitrarily or capriciously. The question is whether the commission's decision was arbitrary or capricious. The commission's decision. Generally?
That took care of one of my points for my 3 minutes. Yes, it's the commission. I hope that my run-through of our decision-making process showed that we were not capricious or arbitrary. The denial of certificate of appropriateness, the first paragraph that's indented says the application was not approved due to the following reason: it's not deteriorated beyond repair. We looked at that and found that was true. That is always one of the first qualifications. I own a Victorian, 2 stories, had lead paint on it, found a painter who took the lead paint off about 10 years ago. He has won several awards for painting Victorians. It happens, they do it. It doesn't seem to be a problem for the painting profession in this town or outlying towns. I have to, even though Jessica is not being judged here as capricious or arbitrary, I cannot listen to her being impugned in this way. I have known her for a couple of years, have seen her as extremely thorough, extremely attentive, and considerate, works extremely hard to inform herself of every possible detail and explain things in extremely careful ways to the applicants and work with them so that we can find the best solution. She knows regulations extremely well, and I have nothing but been impressed. I will say she is extremely busy because this is a city that has a lot of historic districts and conservation districts, and we value those, and so she is the gatekeeper as the things come to the commission. I don't think I have anything else to say, but the Acre man, his view and the Rock Island view of siding differs considerably with all that we have learned about siding on historic houses.
Jessica, I was wondering whether you could comment about to the extent it's relevant, the adjacent property that had aluminum siding. Was that because it was put on before it became historic in that area, or?
Sure. I do remember looking that up when this came up. I haven't looked at it recently, but I believe I did find that it had vinyl or aluminum siding on it prior to the district, so that's why that's on there. My comments were a lack of desire to maintain your property is not a reason to approve applying vinyl or aluminum siding. I do tend to be a scribbler, so I keep handwritten notes of every phone conversation I ever have. It's in a pile, and prior to this appeal, I went through and I have no record of any contact with them prior to September 26th, and I do have a note that the rental inspector came to me in mid-September. I don't have a record of a phone conversation with Jared, so I don't have any knowledge of that happening. I would never give verbal, non-written approval for anything that required approval. Painting does not require approval, so I would give verbal approval for painting.
That's the 3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Genoa. How about the family? 3 minutes, please, if you want to say anything else.
I believe we said.
Please come up if you're going to speak.
I believe we've laid out a compelling case here. Judge it on its merits. Like my wife, I would also like to thank you for your time. I read up on you, and this is a very august group. I mean, most of the town councils I go to, somebody missed an American Legion meeting and found himself on the town council. But you're pretty special. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. All right, so we have a choice here about whether to close the public hearing right now and then have a motion or not close the public hearing, but how can we determine whether it's timely to close the public hearing or whether we want to continue the public hearing?
Whether you feel like you need more information.
Yeah, okay. Does anybody feel like you need more information in order to make a decision? I do not. So, no. All right.
Mayor, I just wanted to point out because of your earlier question about the issue of non-historic and historic.
Could you use your mic, please, Eleanor?
If you look at page 3 of the guidelines, under the heading non-contributing and non-historic properties, you'll see a definition of non-historic in that first paragraph, and then you will also see the process for reclassifying properties.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to close the public hearing. All right, could I have a motion to, let me get the language right, to where'd it go? A motion to affirm the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission
So-
I don't know how the vote will go, but I'd like to have that motion come before us.
So moved.
Moved by Botchway.
Second.
Second by Cole. All right, discussion. So as we do this, I want to recall some points that Eleanor has provided us with. And if I missed something really crucial, Eleanor, please tell me. So first, we are not entitled to substitute our judgment for that of the commission. We might disagree with parts of it, but we're not entitled to substitute our judgment. Rather, if we find that the commission exercised its powers and followed the guidelines established by law, and that its decision was not patently arbitrary or capricious, then we must affirm the commission's decision. If we find that it did act arbitrarily or capriciously or did not follow the rules stipulated in the code and so on, then we can do some other things. But the initial question is what I just stated. Yeah.
That's accurate, and I think you need to focus on those two pieces of that standard. One is were the guidelines followed, and two, was there any arbitrary or capricious decision-making?
Right. So
You've been provided with the guidelines. You need to look at those guidelines and determine that those were followed.
Yeah, well, let's do them one by one. Let's do them one by one about whether the commission exercised its powers and followed the guidelines established by the historic preservation provisions of the city code.
It would seem to me that the commission did. Focusing simply on those narrow things that we can focus on. They have discretion on a case-by-case basis to look at these properties and make that determination, since it is technically non-historic because it hasn't been reevaluated and is non-contributing. An exception could be made. It doesn't mean it has to be made or will be made. It's evaluated on a case-by-case basis. When I read the minutes of the Historic Preservation Commission meeting and look at the guidelines, and either as Jenna Lee or Jessica said, kind of the crucial thing that it came down to for them was that one sentence that, as a representative of mid-century modern homes, the property is intact and worthy of preservation. The existing material should be maintained. There's not a lot of rot. It's not like you have a lot of siding that has to be removed and then replaced either with other pieces of wood or some other type of siding. It's more maintenance of the siding that is there. So to me, they evaluated it, they reached a decision based on a train of facts and logic, which other people may or may not agree with, but it is what they did, I think, in a very logical, thoughtful way. So I think they followed the guidelines.
I think I'd say as well that Jessica clearly articulated the steps that she followed in preparing the information provided to the commission, and the commission was quite clear about the process it went through in coming to the decision it made, including agreeing to consider whether to provide an exception for this particular property. It's not clear to me they really had to do that, but they considered it, and that's worth noting. Anybody else have any views about this particular point that we have to determine?
Well, I would agree with the comments that have been made. I think in terms of the commission's actions were consistent with the guidelines. They did exercise their power and follow the guidelines and did not act either arbitrarily or capriciously.
Oh, let's consider that part.
That's the second.
Yeah.
There was clearly some misunderstanding prior to the commission hearings with respect to reaching a mutual understanding, and that's regrettable. But in terms of the commission's actions, I think they were following the guidelines that were established.
I would agree, John.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I agree with comments made.
I agree.
All right, so let's turn to the second point that we have to determine, and that is whether the commission's action was patently arbitrary or capricious. And a decision is arbitrary or capricious when it is made without regard to the law or the facts of the case. I think it's pretty clear that the commission attended to the law. So, but the rest of you might disagree. So if you agree, then would you say that the decision might have been arbitrary or capricious with regard to the facts of the case?
No, I don't.
Yeah, I don't see any error there. In fact, what I did find interesting, and it was sort of reading through the material, that as we've discussed, the building did pass the 50-year threshold, which when I was first reading the standards, I thought, oh, well, that isn't that the end of the story? But what seems to have happened is the staff and the commission actually looked at this to a higher standard and looking at the house to make sure that it did meet the criteria for preservation with respect to a mid-century house in making their decision. So there was that added layer to the evaluation before they made their decision as to how to then proceed with the siting.
Anybody else have a view about this point?
I would agree. I mean, I don't want to discuss too much into this, but, again, I appreciate you providing kind of reminding us of our singular focus on this particular issue. I mean, obviously there's some questions I have, but is it germane to the commission and the guidelines or whether or not they're arbitrary or capricious? No. So I think that the commission acted as they should.
Anyone else?
Go ahead,
Maz?
I guess I would like just to say a few things about this. As a new council member, I admit that this whole area of historic preservation is very new to me. I am learning about it as fast as I can. I hope you will be patient with me on those kind of decisions. But I would like to thank the city attorney for the memo that explained what the council is being called on the, decide on what is standard of the review we must use in coming to decision. I have read her memo carefully, and I have read the other material in the package for our meeting for this afternoon. I also appreciate the work that the Historic Preservation Commission and the staff have devoted to consider the decision about this. For now, I'm just gonna go with the decision of the Historic Preservation Committee did, because I think that's the right thing to do right now.
Any further discussion?
I guess I would just like to briefly address the Leopolds directly. I think that you all presented a rational, thoughtful discussion on why you feel that aluminum or vinyl siding would be appropriate, and I think you presented some very compelling arguments. However, we go back to the standard. I think it'd be a closer call if we were called in the first instance to sort of make this determination. I think this is a situation where two reasonable minds, we heard two presentations, two thoughtful descriptions of trying to apply in the standards, and I think two parties acting in total good faith. And so given the fact that we have the standard in terms of what we're called upon to review, I don't think that the commission acted in a patently irrational way in terms of doing what they did. So I do think I'm leaning towards the upholding the commission's vote, but that doesn't mean that you didn't present a very compelling case. But I just think in terms of what we're called to do, it's just not sufficient.
I agree with Rockne, and I applaud you for wanting to maintain this home and the historic value of that style from the 50s. Not having the handbook in front of me and knowing, I think you'd mentioned, Ms. Leopold, it's like 100-something pages long, very long. Although you did mention one part of it that maybe Jessica or Jen Lee could explain. You said 3.2, new technology that contributes to the preservation would be appropriate. But that's just like one small portion of it. The commission looked at all of the factors in the handbook that would qualify this home for siding versus not siding. Is that correct?
She's nodding yes.
Yeah, she's nodding yes. Okay. So I believe the commission did follow what they were directed to do as far as the guidelines.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. Any further discussion? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Botchway?
And this is to affirm the decision of the commission.
Cole?
Yes.
Mims?
Yes.
Salee?
Yes.
Taylor?
Yes.
Thomas?
Yes.
Throckmorton?
Yes, motion carries 7-0. Let's see, item 3, could I have a motion to adjourn, please?
Move.
Second.
Moved by Soy, seconded by Botchway. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.